the IATF 16949 podcast, where we talk about all things automotive. Find us on our channel at youtube.com/IATF 16949 auditing, or visit our website at www.iatfglobaloversight.org. This is the IATF 16949 podcast.
Okay, so welcome to this latest version of the IATF Auditing Podcast. I'm delighted again to be joined by Niall Keeley from SMMT and Devon Gage from IAOB. So good afternoon to both of you.
Hi Paul, hi Devin.
Hey guys, thanks for having me.
So what we want to do on this podcast then is review some of the questions that have been posed through the SMMT IAOB YouTube channel. And I think it's worth saying right at the beginning that we do encourage feedback on all the videos that we've produced. There is a commitment to still keep producing videos for the channel, but we really need your interest and your enthusiasm to keep this channel going. So please do post any questions or give us any feedback on subjects that you would like us to cover in future video series.
Particularly easy questions. We like easy questions, so if we can have a few of those, that would be great.
A couple hard.
Yeah, well, maybe the first one is a good place to start off then, because for some reason, MSA seems to be the theme of some of the questions that we've got. And maybe now let's start with you. That I guess you may have heard of an instrument called a mass spectrometer. And the question was, what is a suitable way that we can undertake measurement system analysis for this type of instrument? So I think we should start off right at the basics, Niall. What is your understanding of what a mass spectrometer is?
Yeah, Paul, that's a great way to start this podcast. Again, my initial reaction is maybe we need to be joined by some subject matter experts from time to time. How's the best way to describe it? It's an analytic technique by which chemical substances are identified by the sorting of gaseous ions in electric and magnetic fields according to their mass to charge ratios. Now, I'm going to be honest with you. I'm using Wikipedia to help me out with that first question. But in simple terms, it's a way of getting data on the chemical composition of a material. I think is probably the one line term that would help describe what a mass spectrometer is.
Right, and certainly in my auditing days, this was something I came across. For example, if you were auditing a steel manufacturer or an aluminium manufacturer, mass spectrometer would be something that they would be using. So I guess in simple terms, we can say that this is an instrument to get data on the chemical composition of a material. Mm-hmm. So Devon, how does this instrument get used then, do we think, within automotive suppliers?
Yeah, so typically an operator will prepare a sample for analysis, and then once the sample is prepared, they'll place it into the machine, and the machine will go and do its thing, per se, and come back with results.
So it sounds to me then as if there's not that much human interaction with the mass spectrometer, that it is a very machine-dominant measurement process. Would you agree with that, Devon?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. So now back to you then. So what would be the best way, do we think, that an organisation who has one of these can undertake measurement system analysis to meet the IATF requirement?
Yeah, so again, I guess a sort of underlying requirement is calibration. So the equipment needs to be calibrated, and again, the frequency of calibration will be based on risk, but I would envisage it being on a sort of annual calibration cycle. With most machines, a traceable reference standard is provided of a known chemical composition. So again, that's the reference that would be used. This can be used to verify the instrument at a set frequency, again based on risk. But I think, Paul, from experience, this is something that you would almost do as part of your daily setup, a daily check. much as you would with a CMM or a hardness checker or whatever.
Yeah, no, I understand that. And that certainly backs up my experience that in between maybe the annual calibration, there is a verification activity against a traceable reference standard.
Yeah.
Yeah. Devon, so maybe for the listeners then, how does this relate back to sort of basic MSA principles then?
Yeah, so by undertaking a check against a known reference standard at a defined frequency, this will check bias, and then over time, the stability of the measuring system as well.
Right. And again, I'm sure many of the listeners have heard as part of measurement system analysis that bias and stability, yeah, are checking at location of data, and they're really looking for any drift in the measurement system over time. So, Niall, I think a lot of people then, when we talk about measurement system analysis, think, oh, gauge R and R. So, does an organization, as well as maybe doing bias and stability checks, do they have to undertake R&R studies?
Again, Paul, I would say whilst an R&R study could be undertaken, it would be, I would say, questionable. It would be very time consuming. Again, when we think about the measurement system and the different factors involved, I think in the case of a mass spectrometer, there's very little human intervention in the measurement process. And again, as we know, the IATF standard requires MSA measurement systems analysis to be undertaken, which is not necessarily gauge R&R. So this would probably only be a requirement if it was specified by the customer.
Yeah, and I think that is a key point for the listeners, that a lot of people read into the requirement that MSA has to be undertaken using gauge R&R for each type of measurement system, and that isn't what the requirement says.
Yeah.
It says MSA has to be undertaken, but that could be GR&R, it could be bias, linearity, stability, or something maybe we're going to come on to talk about in a minute, attribute agreement analysis. So thanks for your input on that then. So it seems that MSA is the hot topic for today. So the next question was about MSA for a microscope, and specifically the person that posted this question. This is a microscope used to measure grain size of a metallic material. So how could we go about doing this, do we think, Devon?
Yeah, so first, I think we need to understand if this is a variable or attribute measurement system. Because if it's variable, the microscope needs to be calibrated, as this would be a man-dominant measuring process. A gauge R&R study would be the best way of analyzing variation.
Right. So the key point there is then we need to know what type of measurement system is. What is the microscope being used for? Is it being used for variable measurement, or is it being used for attribute analysis? So now, if we did go down the route of saying maybe then for this a gauge R&R is the right type of study, how could an organization go about doing this for this microscope?
So I guess, Paul, the normal approach would be to take some samples. So 10 samples would need to be prepared for evaluation. You'd want to then select 3 appraisers, and again, they should be the people that would normally do the measurement. And again, this sounds like it would be almost a lab-based activity, but we don't really know, do we, where this microscope is. But yeah, so 10 samples, 3 appraisers, again, people that would normally do this measurement activity. And then each appraiser, each person would measure the grain size of each of the 10 samples at least twice in a random order to collect the raw data.
Right. Okay. So yeah, I think that the key thing is here that we are doing it in the normal work environment.
Yeah.
And as you said, now this could be a laboratory, so that is where we should be doing the MSA
Yeah.
study. And Devon, then, when we've done the study then, and we crunch all these numbers into a software package or an Excel spreadsheet, what would be the acceptance criteria from this Gauge R&R study?
So acceptance criteria would firstly depend on any customer-specific requirements. You would want to go there to check and see what their acceptance criteria states, or you could look at the reference criteria defined by the client.
Right, okay. So CSRs or the reference manual or criteria that is specified in the client's quality management system. So now from a variable point of view then, we've just been talking about Gauge R&R for a microscope. Could the organization or does the organization have to use any other techniques to understand the variation?
So I guess it depends a little bit, but if drift, for example, was seen to be a risk between the calibration intervals, again for all of these questions around MSA, we're using calibration as a basic requirement. So if there was evidence of drift between calibration intervals, a check could be undertaken against a known reference standard. And that would, known as a sort of bias and stability check.
Yeah, but that's again, I think, from what you're saying now, a risk-based decision by the organisation that Gauge R&R looks at the potential variation at a point in time. What this would give us if we did this is any change in the measurement system over time in between the calibration intervals.
Yeah.
So we could be value added to do that as a proactive measure, or maybe if we've seen historic issues with drift of the equipment in between the calibration interval. And Devon then, so in this case so far then, we've been talking about this microscope being used for variable measurement. What happens if it was being used for attribute? Pass, fail?
So then an attribute agreement analysis will be undertaken where some good samples, some not good samples are prepared, normally 50 samples. Again, we would take those 3 appraisers. The study would evaluate the degree of agreement between the appraisers. And then once again, the acceptance criteria would depend on any CSRs or the reference criteria defined by the client.
Good. Okay, so hopefully that was helpful, not just to the person that posed the question, but remember again that IATF 16949 requires measurement system analysis for each type of equipment specified on the control plan. So if we have a mass spectrometer, if we have a microscope used to measure grain size, then for those types of measurement system, we have to undertake measurement system analysis. It's not an option. It is a mandatory auditable requirement. So let's get a little bit less technical now then. So the next question we need to try and interpret, I think. Is it possible to have training on IATF guidelines? So that was the exact wording of the question, Niall. What would you want to know if we were going to answer this question?
Yeah, it's again, as you allude to, Paul, it's a very sort of generic question. And I think the key thing is, well, what do we mean by IATF guidelines? Obviously, the IATF publish 3 key documents: the IATF standard that describes the IATF requirements, the IATF rules for certification, which describe much more about the certification body activity and the certification body approach to audit, and then what I would call the unsung hero of the 3 is the IATF auditor guide. And we're actually in the middle of producing a series of videos on the YouTube channel that go through the essential competencies that are described in lots of detail in the auditor guide, the sort of knowledge and competencies that we would expect IATF auditors to exhibit. But I'm still not sure whether that answers a question on, is it possible to have training on IATF guidelines? I guess there's lots of IATF training available through the training providers and others. I don't know. What do you think, Devin? Or Paul?
Yeah,
Yeah.
well, guidelines is the question here. What is meant by guidelines? But as you say, the National Automotive Industry Associations really do offer quite extensive training throughout the entire automotive system. So I would check with them and see if they have offerings that align with what is your definition of guidelines. I know that AAG does have a reference document that talks about all the requirements within the standard and the reasons behind them. That was just launched last month, so it could be another valuable
Yeah.
resource.
Yeah, no, thanks for that, both of you. And I think that the story here then is please post your questions, but try and make them as clear as you can, because that enables us to give you a really accurate answer that hopefully addresses the question or the concern that you've got. The next question is far more specific then. So you guys might remember that we did produce a video about the use of error proofing and the auditing of error proofing in the manufacturing process. And I guess from my experience in manufacturing, and you might back me up, that we're seeing more use of sensors and counters within the process. And the question is, do checks have to be performed to verify that these sensors or these counters are working correctly? So now, maybe your view first.
Yeah, that's a good specific question. I think in a word, yes, is probably the answer, but the frequency at which they're verified is something that would be based on risk. And obviously, as with many things, the key things to consider are sort of the historic data, the risk of the sensor not working, what risk does that pose to the product, process, or operators, and if a high risk, maybe the effective operation of the sensor could be checked daily, maybe by the operator. If lower risk, maybe part of the standard TPM checks. But again, yeah, it's difficult to know exactly. In this case.
Yeah. I think without knowing the specific sensors and what they're used for. But I think, Devin, is there anything you want to add to that?
I would just say, they have a good point that sensors are becoming more and more common. Sensors, counters, it's part of Internet of Things and all those. You need to check the customer specific requirements or customer requirements just to make sure, because as sensors become more and more and Internet of Things become more and more, oftentimes OEMs will update their requirements based on what they've found as failure modes in the past.
Yeah, no, so I think that's a good additional point then. Has the customer got any additional requirements about the use of error proofing devices, which may have built in sensors or counters? So, no, thank you for those answers. So, they were all the specific questions that we had from the listeners and the viewers of the channel. Now, Niall, I just want to open up a bit more general question then. So I think many of the listeners will know for some time now there has been work that has been going on to revise the IATF scheme rules. I think most people will recognise from 5th edition to 6th edition. Can maybe you just give us a high-level overview to start with of where that revision process is and any potential impact on certified clients?
Yes. So yeah, you're right, Paul. This has been, I'm going to describe it as an ongoing activity for some time now. This is the development of the IATF scheme rules. These are the rules that really the certification bodies have to abide by. So during any activity related to IATF, so it's kind of talks a lot about how the certification body is organized and structured and some of the requirements that are placed on the certification body themselves. But you're right, it does also impact certified clients. So things like audit duration, that comes from the rules. So the rules determines, based on the size of an organisation, the length of time their audit is. But it also goes into details around non-conformity management. So all of the rules around non-conformity management, again, are described in the rules, along with the entire process of applying to be certified, having your application approved, contracts, the audit process from stage 1 through stage 2, surveillance, and everything else. So it's an important document for the scheme. It manages and controls the scheme from a certification body perspective. But as mentioned, it does impact clients, certified organisations. So I can kind of, again, confirm that an initial draft document has been produced, and that's currently being reviewed by a whole range of stakeholders, from the oversight offices, the individuals that undertake witness audits and office assessments. Certification bodies themselves are involved in the review process, along with certified clients. There was an opportunity for any certified client to put themselves forward to review the document and provide feedback. In terms of next steps, all of that feedback, of which there will be lots, will get reviewed and converted into hopefully a final draft that will go to the IATF for their approval.
Right, okay. And Devon, if we think then, obviously this is important to clients, is there likely to be any change in the overall process of certification? If we think about stage 1, stage 2, certification, surveillance, re-certification, and the 3-year cycle, is there going to be any fundamental changes, do we think? I know at this stage it's not finalized.
Yeah, it's not finalized, and we do intend on keeping the 3-year cycles. There's going to be some minor changes throughout on when the opportunities to have your surveillance audits could potentially change. The length of certain audits could potentially change, and time in between could potentially change. But yes, as far as the full 3-year cycle, that will stay intact.
Yeah, and I think it is great that IATF is getting input from all stakeholders, and it'll be interesting. I know you probably haven't got the data now, Niall, but how many certified clients actually did respond with feedback following the communique to all of the certified clients. Have you any idea at this stage how many responses there are out of the 90-odd thousand certified clients?
Again, no, it's a great question. We don't know exactly. We know how many organisations registered to provide feedback. It was around about the 1,000 mark. So it was open to all certified organisations, but so round about 1,000, I think was the number that had registered.
Yeah, just so yesterday was a deadline, Paul. I know that as we approach the deadline, we were getting submissions in by the minute, so we expect there will be quite a bit of feedback to sort through.
Yeah, so with these certified clients, they can't say, well, we didn't have the opportunity to give input, because obviously there was that open invitation. So I guess we'll all watch this space with interest. Niall, is there any idea of the overall implementation timetable at the moment?
Paul, I would be wary of over committing to anything at this point. I think there is an expectation that before the end of the year, a final draft is presented to the IATF for their approval. But whether that happens is an unknown. It's difficult to predict that. But theoretically, by the end of this year, I think we would envisage a final draft being put in front of the IATF for their approval.
Right, and then I guess when there is a final publication, there is bound to be some form of transition period. Again, maybe you can't commit at the moment what that period would be. How much has that been in the past, Devon or Niall, the transition from, so for example, when we went from 3 to 4 or 4 to 5, typically what would be a transition period?
I think historically we've almost done it in parallel with the standard itself. Now,
Right.
Paul, you might be better.
Yeah.
So I think we've almost launched the rules and the standards simultaneously, certainly with rules
Yeah.
fifth. That coincided with the release of IATF 16949. So actually the transition was very much the organisations transitioning to IATF 16949. I think the slight
Okay.
difference
Yeah.
here is it's not the requirements document from a client perspective isn't changing. It's almost the sort of document that controls the way the certification bodies operate that's changing.
Right.
So, but yeah, it's I couldn't say at this point what the transition implementation is probably a better word. What the implementation plan for that revised rules document will be.
Yeah.
But there's no
Yeah.
doubt it will require time. So CBs will need to make changes to their systems and processes that will take time. And certified organisations, they're still going to be audited to the IATF 16949 requirements. They are not changing, but the approach to the audit, there will be some changes in that. There's no doubt about that.
Yeah. Yeah, and again, we can cover that in future
Yeah.
podcasts. And from an auditing perspective, we can cover that in some on-site video audits, which I know we've got another series planned for filming in September.
Yeah.
And final question, I guess, for both of you, and maybe it's an unfair question, but there's always rumours bumping around about when is IATF going to be revised. And I think people historically have thought about the nominal 5-year revision period of ISO 9001. Is there anything on the horizon for a revision of IATF, or is it watch this space?
So I'm going to jump in. I would, Paul, I would say it is definitely being discussed. So it's at the very early stages. The term revision 2 is being discussed again in the very early stages. I think you're right. There's the activities that are ongoing with ISO 9001 and what happens to that standard. But certainly, I guess in the background, we are starting to think about what a second revision might look like. But it's very early stages. Again, there's going to be a whole nother podcast at some point dedicated to that once we know more about plans.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of people out there that have ideas about things they feel are not clear in the current standard that could do with clarification. So I guess IATF might do the same approach where you get input from certification body, from auditors, from clients, and other interested parties. So we will keep you up to date with that.
And actually, Paul, that's a great point. So, and again, we try to structure these podcasts around questions that have come in through either previous podcasts or the YouTube channel. But that's a whole nother topic almost. It would be fascinating to get input from listeners, viewers on what they see as some of the key topics that they think need addressing in any subsequent revision of the standard, because that in itself would be
great
interesting.
Input.
Yeah.
And final question, sanction interpretations and frequently asked questions. Is there any on the horizon that you know of, Devon?
Coming out soon will be a new sanction interpretation revolving around unique site identifiers. So that's something new that we've implemented to make sure that even if the client's building changes by road name or whatnot, but the building itself stays in that same spot, it's tied to that unique site identifier. And you can find those unique site identifiers on the certificate validity check. So they're available for your standalone your remote and extended manufacturing sites.
Right, and
Yeah.
I think that's an addition, isn't it, now? Because I think when it was initially rolled out, it only applied to manufacturing sites. Am I right in that?
You're absolutely right. We've done two things. We've invented a new acronym, the USI, the Unique Site Identifier, but it's a really important reference point for both certified manufacturing sites. So they all have got their own unique USI, Unique Site Identifier. Any extended manufacturing sites where they are attached to sites, they also have a unique USI. And now and the SI that Devin's alluding to is introducing the remote support location. So where we have what we call a standalone remote support location, providing support to a manufacturing site, they too now have a unique site identifier. All of these will start to appear on certificates and letters of conformance. So as new certificates are issued, you will start to see your USI, if you're a certified site, your USI for both the site, the extended manufacturing site, if there is one, and any standalone remote support locations, that information will appear on the certificate. And the nice thing about the USI is it's we sometimes hear the term a forever code. It stays with that physical location. So where certificate numbers change every 3 years, etc., this is a permanent identifier for that location, which will help behind the scenes, let's say, from the scheme management no end. So we're really excited about this kind of development in the way the scheme is organised and structured.
Great. So I think that concludes today's podcast. Again, thanks, Niall, and thanks, Devon, for your valuable input. I hope you as listeners find these useful. Again, please give us feedback. We don't want to do these just for the sake of it. We want to do these that will hopefully clarify things for you, add value to your knowledge of IATF and the related scheme. So we look forward to keeping the video series rolling and doing future podcasts. So thank you, Niall. Thank you, Devon.
Thanks, Paul. Thanks, Devin.
Thank you.
Speak soon.
The IATF 16949 podcast, where we talk about all things automotive. Find us on our channel at youtube.com/IATF 16949 auditing, or visit our website at www.iatfglobaloversight.org. This is the IATF 16949 podcast.